A single unarmed civilian ship. 6 hours of absolute silence as it ignored direct warnings from the United States Navy. The captain knew what was waiting on the other side, yet he never touched the wheel. That isn't stubbornness. That is the kind of desperation you only see when the stakes are existential. Inside that hull was something far more valuable than food or medicine. It carried the specific building blocks of a war machine, the exact components needed to replenish a missile stockpile that is being emptied at an unsustainable rate. But it wasn't just one ship. Thousands of miles away, a second vessel was intercepted near Sri Lanka. 2 ships, 2 days, no coincidence. On the ground, the country has gone dark. The internet has been severed for weeks, replaced by the rhythmic thud of precision strikes. In the silence of Tehran, people check their phones after every blast, praying for a signal that may never come. The leadership calls this patience. They are betting that the world will blink first. It is a cold, calculated gamble and perhaps the most expensive miscalculation a regime can ever make. Secret networks in the hand of China. The ship had a name, Tuska. It looked like every other commercial tanker crossing the Gulf of Oman. No weapons on deck, no military markings, nothing to suggest it was anything other than routine cargo moving through international waters. But the moment the United States Navy issued its first warning, something changed. The captain did not slow down. He did not respond. He kept his course for 6 straight hours, sailing directly toward a blockade backed by the most powerful naval force on the planet. That decision was not made out of pride. That decision was made because the cargo in that hull was worth more to Tehran than the ship itself. Inside were Chinese-made specialty alloys engineered specifically for missile casings, precision electronics designed for guidance systems, fuel line components built for ballistic propulsion. Every single item on that manifest was a piece of a puzzle Iran desperately needed to rebuild a missile stockpile it had been burning through since the war began in February 2026. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had been launching daily barrages of missiles and drones at Israel and targets across the Middle East. Those stockpiles do not replenish themselves, and Iran had run out of ways to restock through legitimate channels years ago. This is where China enters the picture. Beijing has not fired a single shot in this war. It has not sent troops. It has not officially declared any support for Tehran. But the components recovered from the Tuska tell a different story entirely. Specialty alloys do not appear in civilian supply chains by accident. Precision guidance, electronics do not end up in the hull of a sanctioned vessel by coincidence. These materials move through a carefully constructed network of front companies, shell corporations, and falsified shipping documents designed specifically to bypass United States sanctions. China built that pipeline. Iran depended on it. And for years, it worked exactly as intended. The Shadow Fleet was the other half of the system. After becoming the most sanctioned nation on Earth, Iran constructed an entire parallel maritime economy. Dozens of tankers operating under false flags, falsified registrations, and rotating identities. They would load Iranian crude oil in the dead of night, disappear into international waters, and wait for buyers willing to pay below-market rates for sanctioned barrels. It was a system that kept the Iranian economy from total collapse through years of maximum pressure. The regime believed those ships were invisible. They believed international waters were beyond the reach of American enforcement. They were wrong on both counts. The second intercept proved it beyond any argument. A vessel called the Tiffany, a sanctioned oil tanker operating under no national flag, was boarded by United States forces near Sri Lanka. Not in the Gulf of Oman, not near the Strait of Hormuz, nearly 3,000 miles from Iranian waters. The Department of Defense made its position explicit in the statement that followed. International waters are not a refuge for sanctioned vessels. The United States would pursue global maritime enforcement anywhere those vessels operated. That was not a warning. That was a declaration of total economic warfare conducted across every ocean on the planet. 2 ships, 2 days, 2 different oceans. The message from Washington was precise and deliberate. Iran cannot rearm. Iran cannot export oil. Iran cannot receive revenue. Every financial lifeline that kept this regime functioning has now been placed directly in the crosshairs of the United States Navy. The shadow network that China and Iran spent decades building together is being dismantled vessel by vessel, route by route, transaction by transaction. Tehran responded by calling it an act of aggression. They called it a violation of international law. But here's the reality that no state television broadcast inside Iran will ever show its people. A regime that executes its own citizens in the middle of a war, that cuts its own population off from the internet for over 600 consecutive hours, that sends an unarmed civilian captain to his fate rather than surrender its contraband. That regime has no credibility left when it invokes the language of international law. The blockade is working, the intercepts are working, and Iran's leadership knows it. That is precisely why the next move they made was not military, it was diplomatic. And that diplomatic move reveals more about how cornered Tehran truly is than any missile launch ever could. The strategy of someone who has nothing to lose and why it will fail. Iran has played this game before, and it has won before. In Vietnam, the strategy worked. Hold on long enough. Absorb the punishment. Wait for the American public to turn against the war. In Afghanistan, it worked twice. The Taliban did not defeat the United States military. They simply outlasted American patience. In southern Lebanon in 2006, Israeli airstrikes flattened entire neighborhoods. Hezbollah emerged from the rubble, organized a victory rally, and called the destruction a badge of honor. The strategy has a name. In Arabic, it is called muqawamat, resistance. And paired with saber patience, it has humbled every foreign power that tried to break it through force alone. Tehran is running that same playbook right now. The new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, made his position clear in his very first public statement after taking power. Iran would continue its effective defense. The lever of blocking the Strait of Hormuz must continue to be used. The enemy would be made to regret it. Those were not the words of a man open to compromise. Those were the words of a man who believes time is his greatest weapon. Here is what that strategy depends on. It depends on oil prices climbing high enough to fracture American political will. It depends on stock markets dropping far enough to turn voters against the war. It depends on congressional elections at the end of the year creating enough domestic pressure to force Washington into a retreat. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, said it plainly. The spike in global oil prices was proof that Iran would not capitulate. The West, he argued, is more worried about oil prices than about defeating Iran. That argument would be compelling if the numbers supported it. They do not. When this war began in February 2026, oil was trading at around $65 per barrel. At the peak of the initial panic, it climbed to around $120 per barrel. Today, it sits at around $85 per barrel. Painful, but not catastrophic. Not the kind of number that sends American voters into the streets demanding an end to the war. And the United States stock market is not collapsing under the weight of this conflict. It is sitting near all-time highs. The economic pressure Iran is counting on to break American resolve simply has not materialized at the scale Tehran needs it to. This is where Iran's strategy starts to crack. The comparison to Vietnam and Afghanistan breaks down at one critical point. In Vietnam, American boys were coming home in body bags, 58,000 of them. The draft was pulling sons out of living rooms across the country. In Afghanistan, troops spent years on rotation, watched their friends die, and came home to a war the public could no longer explain. That human cost was what broke American political will, not oil prices, not stock markets, the coffins. There are no American coffins in this war. Not one United States service member has died in combat operations against Iran. This war is being fought with precision munitions launched from aircraft flying uncontested over Iranian airspace. It is being fought with a naval blockade that does not require a single soldier to set foot on Iranian soil. The political calculus that Iran is counting on simply does not exist in this conflict the way it existed in Vietnam or Afghanistan. Meanwhile, inside Iran, the cost is being paid entirely by civilians. The facts are undeniable. At least 1,464 civilians were confirmed dead. 217 of them are children. An elementary school in Minab, where more than 170 people were killed in a single strike. A woman in her 40s in Tehran reaches for her phone after every explosion to find out if her children are still alive. A mother wrote to journalists from inside the blackout zone saying that even those who once cheered for American intervention did not truly understand what war was until it arrived at their door. 90 million people. 90 million separate experiences of this war. Some still hold out hope for what one Tehran man calls the final victory, the moment when Iranians themselves, not the regime, not a foreign power, hold the future of their country in their own hands. Others simply want the explosions to stop. One woman wrote 3 words that cut through every geopolitical argument ever made about this conflict. The country is being destroyed. That fracture inside Iranian society is the one variable Tehran's strategists cannot control. A war of exhaustion only works when the population stands united behind the leadership absorbing the punishment. But the facts on the ground inside Iran tell a different story. The regime is not fighting with its people, it is fighting in spite of them. And a government that cuts its own citizens off from the internet for over 600 consecutive hours, that executes 3 of its own people in the middle of a war, that government is not leading a nation in resistance. It is holding a nation hostage. Iran's leadership is not wrong about one thing. Patience is a weapon, but patience requires a foundation. It requires an economy that can sustain the weight of war. It requires a population that believes in what it is enduring. And it requires a miscalculation by the other side. Right now, Tehran is running out of all 3. The blockade has cut off oil revenue, the intercepts have severed the resupply chain, the economy was already fracturing before the first bomb fell, and now it is accelerating toward a breaking point that no amount of resistance rhetoric can paper over. Inflation is extreme. Prices are rising faster than wages ever could. Millions of Iranians have not worked in months. Every conversation, according to Iranians themselves, comes back to the same subject: money. The real problem of the Iranian people is economic, and that economic crisis is the one front where Iran has no defense left to offer. The Taliban told American forces for years, "You have the watches, we have the time." Tehran borrowed that line. But there is a difference between a guerrilla movement fighting in mountain passes and a nation-state hemorrhaging revenue, losing its supply chains, and watching its own people lose faith in the cause. Time is only a weapon when you can afford to spend it. Iran is running out of time, and the table in Islamabad may be the last place left where they can trade what remains of it for something worth having. Islamabad, the negotiating table, or the final show, J.D. Vance boarded a plane for a 16-hour flight to Islamabad, Pakistan. 16 hours. That is how far the United States was willing to go, to offer Iran one last chance at the table. Iran needed only a fraction of that time to make the same trip. Yet even in the final hours, nobody in Tehran could say clearly whether their delegation would actually show up. That hesitation was not confusion, it was a strategy. Iran has used this method before. Before previous negotiations, officials and state media sent out contradictory signals for days. Yes, no, maybe, then yes again. The same pattern appeared before Islamabad. One channel said the delegation was coming. Another said it was not. Senior officials contradicted each other in public. The goal was obvious. Keep Washington uncertain. Keep the other side waiting. Raise the diplomatic temperature high enough that concessions might come before the talks even begin. But that tactic only works when you still have leverage. And that is exactly what Tehran is losing. The gap between the two sides in Islamabad is not narrow, it is enormous. Washington is demanding that Iran surrender its enriched uranium stockpile and accept binding restrictions on its missile program. Those are not opening offers meant to be trimmed down at leisure. They reflect a side that believes it has already established military dominance and now wants political terms to match it. Iran, meanwhile, is demanding war reparations and formal recognition of its sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, the same waterway that carries a huge share of the world's daily oil supply. In effect, Tehran is asking for a legal choke point over the global energy system as part of a peace arrangement. That demand does not show strength. It shows how detached Iran's negotiating posture has become from the reality of its position. The pressure on Tehran is growing faster than its leaders expected. Every shadow tanker intercepted is revenue that never reaches the regime. Every shipment of components seized is another delay in rebuilding missile capacity. Every day the blackout continues is another day the regime spends more political capital suppressing its own people than resisting its foreign enemies. The costs are stacking up. And unlike the United States, Iran does not have the reserves to absorb those costs indefinitely. That reality becomes even clearer when you look inside the country. One woman in Tehran wrote that she fears what comes after the war more than the war itself. She fears that if the regime survives, it will come out more savage, more paranoid, and more willing to punish the young people who dared to hope for change. That fear is not abstract. In the middle of an active war, while negotiations were supposedly on the table, the Iranian government executed 3 of its own citizens. That is the regime sending delegates to Islamabad. A government does not execute its own people during wartime diplomacy because it feels secure. It does it because it is afraid. Afraid of what those citizens represent. Afraid of what happens when fear gives way to anger. Afraid of what leaks through every VPN, every whisper, every family conversation after the explosions stop. Iran is not only confronting American and Israeli pressure from the outside, it is also confronting a crisis of legitimacy from within. And no regime can fight both fronts forever. This is what makes Islamabad so important. It is not just another round of talks. It is a stress test for whether Tehran still has room to maneuver. Iran's traditional waiting game worked in earlier conflicts because the other side kept paying in blood and eventually lost the political will to continue. But that formula depends on American casualties, public exhaustion, and a mission that drifts into confusion. This war does not fit that model. There are no American body bags coming home from Iranian soil. No drawn-out ground occupation. No endless troop rotations eating away at public patience. Iran is trying to run an old strategy against a very different kind of American pressure, one built on air power, naval enforcement, sanctions, and distance. Its old playbook was not designed for this. That is why Islamabad matters, not because it promises peace, but because it may be the last place where Iran can trade time for something real before time itself stops working in its favor. 2 ships, 1 verdict. Iran entered this conflict betting on a ghost, the memory of American fatigue. They expected body bags and domestic chaos in Washington to do the work that missiles could not. But the math has changed. With no boots on the ground and no flags over coffins, the internal pressure that once broke American resolve is simply absent. Iran's strategy of outlasting the enemy has hit a wall of cold, calculated persistence. Behind the bravado, the system is fraying. You don't resort to extreme domestic crackdowns during a ceasefire talk unless you are terrified of the ground shifting beneath you. The Iranian people aren't asking for proxy wars that empty their shelves. They are asking for a future that actually belongs to them. A future where dignity isn't a luxury and the internet isn't a weapon used against them. Washington isn't just guarding a waterway, it is dismantling a legacy of instability. The door to a deal remains open, the clock is ticking, and for the first time, the United States is not blinking. The real question is whether Tehran will walk through that door before the floor beneath them completely gives way. What is the true breaking point for the regime, the economic blockade, or the silent resentment of its own people? Let us know your thoughts below and follow for more deep dives into the shifts reshaping our world.